by way of an introduction, I'll just say that in the past few years, the collecting that we do around current events has moved online. So we've been asking ourselves, well, what do we do when the donor isn't in the room with us? What do we do when we aren't drawing up a deed of gift for them to sign? And what do we do when we're not actually taking custody of the original items that we're collecting? And in many cases, we're taking custody of copies, and maybe not getting ourselves the copyright. So Creative Commons has been a helpful tool in addressing some of those tricky questions. But we also have learned that Creative Commons is pretty tricky itself. So enter Megan MacGregor. Megan is the Outreach and Instruction Librarian at University of Southern Maine Libraries. She recently completed Creative Commons training and has become our resident expert here at USM. And something I really appreciate about Megan is that she's interested in local history and archives. And so, of course, I jumped at the suggestion that we bring her in to share what she knows. So Megan, thank you very much for joining us, and take it away.
Great, thanks, Jill. And let me share my screen. Can you give me co-host sharing abilities?
Yes, just a moment.
Okay, and while I get the power, so just so, and also so everyone here understands, like, so I have my master's in museum studies, and I worked for at the start of my career before the first Great Recession happened, in the museum world before I turned into libraries. So I do understand a lot of the point of view that you guys are coming from at these collections and stuff. So, which is helpful because I can help translate sometimes, and it's not. I won't be confused when you say it's found in collection. I completely understand the dead hand clauses that can occur. Okay, great. Let me share my screen. Let me launch my slides. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, great. Okay, so let's talk about cooking with Creative Commons. So this is a Creative Commons license. This is the Creative Commons license of this presentation, my work. So we are going to basically help you understand and translate all this gobbledygook of all these little symbols that strikes fear into your hearts when you first look at it sometimes. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better grasp of when you come across something like this in the wild, and also how to apply it to your own stuff that you have. So first, very, 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 very big red flag. This is not legal advice in any way, shape, or form. I am not a lawyer. If someone is coming at you demanding money because you screwed up on a Creative Commons license, like, this is not the presentation to be like, but Megan said that this is safe. It's not. That's a lawyer issue. Talk to a lawyer. This is pure information for informational purposes. So just big disclaimer here. So if this was going to be your legal advice, please stop now. Go find a lawyer. Don't use me. Okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to go really quickly over some really basic things about copyright law. So how it works, some of the basic rules and exceptions, because those have a big thing to play with when it comes into Creative Commons. So we're going to talk about what Creative Commons licenses are, and basically how to use them as a creator. So if you create something, how you put a license on it, and then if you use something that has a Creative Commons license, how to use that license. So just to start, in the chat, and I've seen for those of you that responded in that Google form, thank you so much. That was very informative. A lot of you were hitting in that middle mark of this question of what level of knowledge do you feel you have about Creative Commons licenses. If people just want to put in a number in the chat, of 1 being like, I know absolutely nothing, and 5 being like, gosh, I know everything, possibly too much. Yeah, okay, yeah, so that mid-range still. Mid-range on the towards the 1-y end. Okay, great, perfect. So kind of middling range, which is not surprising. I feel a lot of times we've seen these things and we've heard of these things, but we don't have a good grasp of what exactly they are. I know I certainly didn't. So we are all on common footing. Okay, so let's talk about copyright for a second. And we don't have to put it in the chat, kind of like just take a moment and reflect for yourself. What can you copyright? Because I'm sure we have all heard copyright bandied about. But just kind of take a moment and think to yourself of like, what can you copyright? Could you copyright your dog? Could you copyright a picture? Could you copyright a song that you sing in the bathroom? You know? And the answer is you can copyright a lot of stuff. Basically, copyright is one of the things that was created as a form of legal protection for intellectual property law. So it protects basically creations of the minds, and it's basically part of a set. So there's copyright that protects against, but there's also trademark. So trademarks is purely for protecting about brands, words and logos, so all those kind of brandy things. There's also patent law, so that's like for inventions and stuff like that. And creative or copyright law is for literary and artistic works for the most part. So basically it's the rights of a creator to copy and distribute their work. So for example, if all of you want to take a piece of paper, if you have a piece of scrap paper somewhere, if you look at this description of a fish and you sketch really quick a little picture of a fish based on this illustration. And if when you're done, you want to hold your fish up to the camera so we can all see everybody's fish. Beautiful. Lovely. How fast are people at sketching becomes a game. So yeah, so as you've drawn that fish, so that is an artistic work, right? That is something that you have created. So you as the creator of that fish have the control of the exclusive rights over the use of that fish, and if somebody gets to copy that fish. It's basically something that they put into law in order to make sure that you as the creator of that fish picture you've just drawn, if it blows up and becomes this massive thing, you get to get the benefit of it. So you're encouraged in some ways to share, because you get to say that person can copy it for a good $10.99 in my hand or not. So you get to control that. So how do you get copyright protection? That's a little bit tricky. So it's simple, but it's not necessarily 100% simple. So you basically, there are a few rules that come into play to actually get copyright for your creation. And that basically kind of depends a little bit of where in the world you are, because copyright law is not universal, it is country-based. So first and foremost, for the most part, you cannot, if you come up with something, so like if you come up with either a fact or an idea, that's not copyrightable. So the fact that that Glickman Library is at like 123 Forest Ave, that is not a copyrightable thing, because that's a fact. It's a cold hard data fact. So like a phone book with addresses and numbers, that's not copyrightable. That's just pure data. The readings off of a thermometer for 1984, that is not copyrightable. That's pure hard fact. The same thing for just pure ideas of like, if you just have an idea in your head of like, I'm going to paint this amazing picture, there's going to be like a yellow sun, there's going to be a purple bird flying across the sun at a certain angle, that's not copyrightable either. It's just, if it's just ephemera in your head, that's not copyrightable. However, the instant you put that bird in the sun into a tangible form, so if it is, that is when that becomes copyrightable. So that could be a literary work, that could be an artistic work, that could be a musical work, visual arts, a dramatic or cinematic work, software, and also databases. So anytime this becomes something you can actually in some way interact with or touch, that's when it becomes copyrighted. Another side of this is that, so when you create the thing, so when you have the physical object, so that picture of your fish that you've now all drawn, you automatically have the copyright level of all rights reserved. So you have all the rights to your stuff that you drew there on that fish picture. If you were then to turn around and write a poem about that fish picture, you would have, as the creator, all the rights that have anything to do with that fish picture. You can then delegate out if you want to sell those rights or keep those rights or allow or change those rights, but all the rights still are in your pocket. You could further, sometimes you hear people of like, oh, you need to register your work with the US Copyright Office. That's not true. The only time that does become true, if you want to sue somebody in federal court, then yes, you do need to register your work with the Federal Copyright Office. But that could be, you suddenly discover somebody's used your work, you then turn around and register your work at the Copyright Office, and then you sue that person. So it doesn't have to be at the point of creation. Like you don't have like a window of 30 days or something like that to get and register your work. So you automatically have copyright unless you want to sue somebody in federal court, in which case you would need copyright. But it's not necessary. You still have copyright. So as I said, every country does copyright differently. So there are a bunch of fundamental ideas that kind of always are present in all of the copyright law throughout the world. So some of those are that copyright applies to work as soon as it becomes tangible. So once again, it's a form. That the copyrighted work must meet a standard of original content. So is it different from that other person's thing that they just made over there? Copyright also grants the exclusive rights to the owner of copyright. So that's those all rights reserved. They get specific rights because they are the creator of that work. Copyright protection lasts a long time. The length of that time shifts around where you are in the world. Here in the US, if you are an individual creator, copyright of your work lasts for the entirety of your lifetime and then 70 years afterwards. If you were a corporation, that changes. So if you were a corporation, it's 95 years after the publication of the thing, so after you put it into a tangible form, or 120 years after the creation. So maybe it was like, you know, that early initial design sketch that the company was using to mock up to decide which direction they were going on with a product or something. And then whichever, so either the 95 or the 120 years, whichever one's ends first, that's the life of that copyright that the company has over that thing. So it can be a long time. And then lastly, copyright protection may be limited to serve the public interest. And that last one is where we get into exceptions and limitations, because while, yes, anything you create has copyright, if it's an artistic or literary work, there are exceptions and limitations to that, because otherwise we couldn't use anything at any time without going to somebody and asking their permission all the time, and that's not feasible, because that would be awkward, because stuff is culture and that's hard to do. So there are a bunch of exceptions and limitations to copyright where you don't, and basically by exception and limitation, that means I don't have to go find the person who created it and ask them if I can use it for XYZ purpose. So the first thing is for, you don't have to ask for permission if you are using it for purpose of criticism. So if I am reviewing a movie, I do not have to ask permission to quote in the movie or show a clip for purposes of my review and criticism of that movie. I also don't have to ask permission if I am doing a parody. So if I am writing Jane Austen and zombies, or Pride and Prejudice and zombies, I don't have to ask Jane Austen, even if she was alive and she still had copyright, whether that's okay. It's parody. Think of all those sketch comedies that you've seen that are like a Saturday Night Live that are parodies off of the thing. I don't have to ask permission to do that. It's a joke. The last thing is also to make something accessible for the visually impaired. So basically, if I need to do there needs to be a spoken word dialogue over a movie clip or something like that, any kind of thing to make it accessible to people, or I need to copy it in a certain way for people to have access to it, that is also protected. And you don't have to seek permission from the author or the creator to do that kind of thing. Also in the US, there is also a set of rules called fair use, or the 4-factor test, that determines whether or not a use falls outside of copyright. So this is where this whole concept of like, it's for educational purposes, therefore it's not, I don't have to seek permission for copyright. That's not entirely true, but this is where that thing comes from. So these are basically guidelines. So this is basically, some countries have much stricter guidelines where basically it's like, it will say this very specific use, like watching a movie in a class, that is protected. You don't have to do copyright. In the US, we have this kind of floaty idea that we have to apply to every single thing, which is the thing that makes us nervous all the time. So when a court, basically, it's because it's the judges will look at how you used a thing and basically weigh each of these 4 factors equally. So just because it's for educational purposes may or may not, the other 3 factors also are going to be weighed. So those factors are the purpose or the character of the use. So what are you using it for? How are you using it? The nature of the copyrighted work. So was the copyrighted work purely facts and figures, or was it way more creative? The amount and the substance of the portion you were taking, did you photocopy the entire book? Did you just photocopy part of the book? And then also the effect on the use's potential market. So did you turn around and sell this? Are you taking money out of the creator's pocket in any way, or not? So all of those things are going to be weighed against you when it comes to kind of the legalese of, can I use this without having to ask permission or not? So the last exception is if something is in the public domain. So the public domain is basically this warehouse of things that have fallen out or never were copyrightable in the first place. So things can fall out of copyright because the extent of their copyright, the legality of their copyright has ended. So that lifetime plus 70 years, or that whole mumbo jumbo of corporation ends. It could have been a factor idea, so it was never copyrightable in the first place. Somebody can also put something into the public domain, which we'll talk about in a second. Or whatever they had, the creator failed in some countries. You sometimes have to basically keep renewing your copyright. So if you don't, if the creator didn't go in and like register their copyright or something like that, then it may also end up in the public domain. So it's basically this big open, it's a big open free pile is what it is. So this is the first time we're going to touch on Creative Commons. So in Creative Commons, there are 2 symbols for things that are in the public domain, which basically means like super, super free to use, no worries whatsoever. The first is this public domain symbol with the little C, copyright, and the cross out for it's not copyrighted. That means that basically the work came into the public domain naturally by one of those ways I just mentioned. It started in or became public domain. There's also the CC, which is Creative Commons, CC 0 license. And if it's a CC 0 license, then that means that the person who created the work, so the person who held the copyright to it, basically said, I am giving you this and all the rights I have as free to use, free to share, free to tear it apart, do whatever you want with it. I am giving you this as part into the public domain. So it's not kind of classic public domain, but it's still public domain legally in every way, shape, and form. So just something to keep in mind, that something can also be kind of put in public domain by a human being. So we're going to do, let me just check time. So we're going to do a really quick activity. So I am going to, let me grab. So there are 2 pictures of a fish here. So I am going to if you grab, so I'm going to put in the chat the links to these two pictures, so picture A and picture B. If you want to click on one of them and tell me which fish was put in the public domain, so who has that CC0, and which fish came into the public domain naturally. You can put it in the chat. Yep. Yes, correct. So A was naturally put in there because it has that C with the cross out, and B was put in there automatically by its creator. Yes. So you can see, you can start to see, you can understand these things when you see them in the wild. All right. Great. All right. So let's talk about Creative Commons, what we're all here for. So why the heck did we just talk about copyright? We're here for Creative Commons. Why are we talking about copyright? The reason is that they are one and the same thing. So copyright, so basically Creative Commons uses copyright, all the laws and the underpinnings that goes with it as a way, in a way so that it can function. So all the legal underpinnings of Creative Commons that allow you to do the things that you can do in with the Creative Commons licenses, it's all upheld by copyright. If you do not have copyright, you cannot do something, you cannot put a license on something from Creative Commons with Creative Commons. They're one system, it's not two systems, which I know kind of culturally it's been pushed as two different systems. So basically together they work, Creative Commons works with copyright laws, legal underpinnings to make it possible to do all the things and to take action. So you can sue somebody for Creative Commons infringement anywhere in the world, and they specifically made it that way so that it's a universal system rather than country by country, which happens with Creative Commons and stuff like that. So I know one of you asked the questions about if you got an anonymous donation of, it's the same thing of, did they sign any kind of paperwork whatsoever, and what was the copyright they agreed to, or what kind of rights did they turn over, if they turned over anything to you at all? Because again, if you don't have copyright, then you don't have the ability to put a Creative Commons license on it. We're going to talk about a little bit of ways you can get, you can kind of work with Creative Commons to create stuff. But we'll talk about that as we go on. So keep those questions. We'll get to that. Okay. So really quickly, what the heck is Creative Commons? Creative Commons was basically created in 2002 by a bunch of computer folks and computer scientist folks and academic folks, because they realized that human beings needed a better way to share things, especially because by that time we had the internet, and God knows we can copy things so quickly and make things move so fast on the internet. And so we needed a better way to share rather than that copyright, all rights reserved. Because like if I draw a picture of a fish, maybe I don't care if you use it. I'm fine if you go and use it in any way, shape, or form. So they wanted to basically create a way that people could allow people to could share things or use things in ways that were much easier than having to like drill down and find someone and be like, hello, my name is Bob. I would like to use your fish picture in a book I am writing. Can I use it? And whereas Bob was like, I really don't care. I don't remember drawing the fish picture. I don't care. So they're trying to make it a lot easier. So it's 100% legit. They basically got lawyers. They grabbed copyright law, and they basically created these Creative Commons licenses. So these are ways that people can share stuff that they have made, and also allow them to use things much easier than kind of traditional copyright. In the process of creating these things, they also ended up creating kind of a culture as well. So there are 2 billion people worldwide that use Creative Commons licenses on their stuff. And there is also a massive community of people that are very much all about kind of the open movement of this idea that culture should be free. We should be free to share ideas and creative thoughts more easily between stuff. And so it's this whole idea of openness and sharing and like human collaboration, and why can't we just all get alongness that is there with online for the most part. Like, so open educational resources, that's part of this whole open movement. A lot of museums are now moving in this movement as well, with which I have some resources about specific groups called GLAM and stuff like that, that are working with Creative Commons licenses and ways to make this kind of culture much more open and sharing, rather than closed down and elitist. Okay, so let's talk about the elements. So this is it. There's nothing else. There are 4 bits that make up every single Creative Commons license. Now, this is more of an ingredients list. This is not a choose your own adventure. So these are just the bits that make up the licenses. The licenses are solid. There are 6 licenses. You cannot go and create your own outside of those 6 licenses using these elements, right? So this is basically not so that you can be like, great, I want a BY, I want an NC, I want an SA and an ND all at the same time. You can't do that. This is basically just so you understand the underpinnings of what all the licenses are made up to be. So basically, all they do is basically tell you what you can and cannot do with all the Creative Commons stuff. So for example, all of the licenses are going to have this BY, which is attribution. That means you basically have to give credit to the original creator, which as a librarian and an academic, that to me is second nature. You need to, there's also share alike. So basically, if you create an adaptation off of something, so if you make if somebody copies that fish picture and does something new with it, they have to keep the original, they have to keep the same license that you did. So that forces it to stay open. Nobody can be like, ha 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 ha, no one shall use this. I shall copy it, and then no one will be able to use this in the same way again. Not so. You will force them to keep it open in some way and be able to use it maybe the same way you allowed yours to be used. There's also non-commercial, so that means that that you cannot basically take something, slap it on a bag, sell it on Etsy somewhere. You can only use the work in the way that you want to use it, as long as it's not for money. It doesn't mean that if you are a non-commercial entity, you can use it in any way you want. That's not the way it works. It's purely how you're using the work, not if the person using it and their affiliations. There's also no derivatives. So this means that you can't mess around. You can share. So for example, if you take that picture of a fish picture, it means that I can't do anything to your fish picture, but I can share it with somebody else and be like, look at this wonderful fish picture. Look at this wonderful fish picture. This fish picture is great, but I can't like cut it off and put legs on it or like change the colors or anything like that. It has to be purely in the form that it arrived in when you made it. Okay, so given those four elements, let's talk about the 6 licenses. So this is where the rubber meets the road. So the licenses, as I said, are made up of all of these elements. Some of them, as I said, like that BY, so the fact I have to when I use something, attribute the original author, that is in all 6 of the licenses. That's the only thing. Other stuff doesn't appear in all the licenses. So the fact that this one, so the non-commercial only shows up in 3 of the licenses. So it's a hodgepodge of what is what. So each of the licenses, so these are the 6. These are the first 3. These are the last 3. We'll kind of go through each one. Basically, the only thing you have to worry about is that each of these licenses, there are 2 main factors of can you or can't you use it commercially, and can you or can't you remix it or adapt it. And outside of that, you just have to give attribution. So the first one, the BY, oops, as I clicked. The CC-BY, so you can see up here, it's called the attribution license. This is what you might see it look like in the wild. This is the symbol for it. And these are things you can easily search for online. It's also in that handout. So these are, you can share it, you can adapt it, even commercially. So you can adapt something and sell it on a bag. You just have to attribute the author. And you have to mention if you made any changes. That's kind of a standard one as well. The share alike, that means, once again, you can share it, you can adapt it. You have to attribute the author and note if you made changes. And with that share alike license, that's where you have to, whatever license you give to your work that new work that you've created, that has to be the same as the license before that you got it from. So in this case, if you have this license, then the work that you made is probably going to have this license, or at least a license that includes that share alike element. So the no derivatives license, so this is what it looks like in the wild. You can share it, even commercially you can share this, but you cannot change the work in any way. You have to attribute the author, you have to note if you made changes. So you can't distribute this work. This is something you can keep in the privacy of your own home that you can just do for fun, but you cannot share, like post this online or do anything out in the wide world with it. The non-commercial license, you can share it, you can adapt it, as long as you attribute it. You just can't sell this for commercial purposes. So you can't turn around and sell this for $10.99 on the street with your on the bag. Non-commercial share alike, so just what it sounds like. So you can share it, you can adapt it, but you have to attribute the author. You have to note if you make changes, but you can't use this for a commercial purpose. So you can't put this on a bag, and you have to keep it the same license that you found it. So it has to have this share alike license involved, and it has to be for non-commercial. And then the last one is this is kind of the most closed, as we say, of the licenses, because you can do the least amount of things with it. So it's non-commercial and no derivatives license. So you can't sell it, you can't make any changes to it, and you can't use it for commercial purposes. So and you can't change it up and then share that thing. So it's really locked down. So this is basically the closest to copyright you're going to get in a Creative Commons license of that traditional Creative Commons or copyright all rights reserved license. So to kind of give you a better idea of what we just talked about, so this is a lovely little chart that gives you all the licenses kind of in the order of how opened or closed they are. So these first couple ones up here, so that this is that Creative Commons, you could put something in the Creative Commons. That BY license, it's very open, the BY license share alike. So you can share these, you can remix, you can use these for commercial purposes. When you get into the non-commercial and the share alike, you can remix and you can share those, but what you can do, because you can't share, you can't do it for commercial purposes, and you have to share it in the same, you have to reshare this one in the same kind of license. Those are much more limited in what you can do with them and how you can use them. And then of course, the most locked down are the no derivative ones. Those you can share. That thing you found that has that non-derivative element in it, you can share. Look here, I have this thing, but you can't like put a mustache on that thing or change the coloration or do anything like that. So, and then down at the bottom, that's that classic copyright. So does that make sense to everybody so far? Just checking in. Okay, great.
So
yeah,
I do have a question
yeah,
in the chat from Jill that I think you might have just answered, but just so everybody can hear it again, Jill, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I just wanted to clarify about what non-derivative means, because so many questions. But here's an example. Let's say you have a picture of a fish and it's in color, and you want to print it in a book. Can you print it in black and white?
If the fish, so if
it's
fish,
non-derivative.
If it's non-derivative,
Yeah.
I would say no, because you would have to keep it exactly how it is, how the author intended. But if you were to completely, I think because the change isn't big enough, of a change for it to be to be considered like a new piece of work. But if you did like a pencil line drawing based off of that fish, you might be able to get away with it. That's where kind of those weird questions of like, does that count? Copyright questions come in and play havoc with Creative Commons stuff, because you're never really quite sure. Because that whole concept of what makes a work different enough to count is a bit of a gray line.
Yeah. Definitely a gray area. So you can't tell us where that line is.
I can't tell you where that line is.
Okay,
unfortunately, only
it.
the court can. And that specific time, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Okay, so just again, take a minute and just do a reflection of, so think about something that you've created. It could be an academic work, it could be creative that you're really proud of. And think about, if you shared that work with others, would you be okay with them doing, like Jill said, making an adaptation of it in some way, like changing the color or putting a weird face on it or cutting it into bits and pieces, or using it for commercial purposes? So either of those two things. So just think about that for a second. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about using those Creative Commons licenses, but on your own work. So you are the creator, you have all drawn fish pictures at this point, so let's put a license on that fish picture. So let's talk about that. So another big red flag. So when you put a Creative Commons license on your work, even if it's in a flippant moment in the middle of a session where you're learning about Creative Commons, that is legally binding. You have legally put a license on that work that has legal underpinnings. So if you decide today that you want to do a Creative Commons BY license on your fish, and then a week later you turn around and be like, that was a terrible idea, I want to lock this fish down, this is gold. And you want to put a much more restrictive license on it, you can, but that license for the BY still holds. So somebody can go and find that, shall we say, more free and open fish and still use it. It's still available. So it is a legal agreement that you enter into when you do put a Creative Commons license on something, and you can't cancel it, but and it will apply to that work until your copyright runs out. But you can re-release, as I kind of suggested in that scenario, you can re-release your work under a different license, but both are still going to be available for people. So you can have that really open BY fish, or you could have that incredibly locked down BY and that whole gobbledygook of that last license, where you can't do anything to that fish, but both still have to be available for the public to use and are legally okay to use. So thinking about what kind of license that you want to use for your work, this little flow chart is in the handouts that I gave to all of you, in which I'll share again after the session, so all of you will have access to them. So this is a handy flow chart of like, what do you actually want to have happen to your work, and what are you okay with people doing with your work when you release it? So this is kind of nice that you can work through this and kind of think about those things of like, is it okay if they do this to them? Which mostly comes down to, do you want to allow people to use this, do any kind of remixing to this? And do you want to make people use the same kind of licensing you've used? And do you want to make it available for that they can get money off of their derivative of whatever it is you're doing? So those are kind of things that you have to keep in mind. So the other thing, so basically to get a Creative Commons license on your work, unlike copyright, it's not automatic. You're not like, I declare this is Creative Commons. It's not the same. The only thing you have to do is basically give it a license by this little formula. It's called TASL, T-A-S-L. You give your thing a title, and you say it's by and your name, the author, the source, so where people can find it, so where people can go to find the original fish, and then the license that you decide to use. So what CC license do you want to use for your thing? And then and then if this was like a derivative work, if there was any description of if you made any modifications. So if this fish was originally from something else, I'd have to note, by the way, this fish is just a copy of this other fish I found. I changed color. In this case, because it's originally mine, I don't have to do this description bottom thing. So this over here is what my fish license would be. This is called That Fish by MacGregor, is licensed under CC BY, so super open. 4.0, that's just the newest version of the Creative Commons licenses because they went through iterations. And then this is a link to what it means by that Creative Commons license. So if somebody's like, I don't know what CC BY 4.0 is, they can click on this link here, and that would take them to the explanation of what they can and cannot do with my fish picture. So basically, for when you create a CC license attached to a thing, and this is, I'm just using an image. This could also be a written work. This could be a sound clip. This could be anything, any of those things that would fall under creative work. It's not just pictures. I'm using pictures because we're in a picture-y kind of environment, but this whole slideshow has a Creative Commons license. So it can apply to everything. So when you're making a license like this, basically think of yourself as the person who would want to use this. So make sure that this is clear, that they see the fish and they see the licensing so they understand it's easy to find if they want to make a change to it or they're curious about it. That it's in a prominent place so they can see where stuff is, or it makes sense of where stuff is. So maybe, for example, for licensing this entire presentation, the license is at the start so that it's very clear that this is for the whole thing. If I wanted, or maybe something's in a works cited for like a presentation, if you were citing something and you created something in there. So wherever it makes sense. And that's it. The rules are really fast and like wide open after that. That's all they say. Just have a tassel, they say. That's all you need. Basically just point out, tell them what the title is, your name, and the license that you want. That's it. That's all you have to have. I, as an academic, am very drilled into that whole kind of idea of citation, and that there is a very strict formula. This is it. That's all the formula there is, which messed me up a little bit. So just for the interest of time, I'm going to just skip through over here, but feel free to go back in time and give your fish a CC license. Okay, so let's talk about using Creative Commons licenses when you want to use somebody else's work that already has a Creative Commons license. Here are some places to find Creative Commons things with licenses on them. The Creative Commons resource list by type is the most helpful one. There's also a Creative Commons search where you can search for images that are have Creative Commons licenses, and I think a few other things like sound clips as well. That's really helpful as well. So just an FYI. Okay. So when you use something, there are Creative Commons sees, basically Creative Commons works with the understanding that there are two types of ways you can use a source. And when I say use, I mean not just the like share aspect, but that kind of remix idea. So that there is like you've taken something, but there's some other elements involved. So one of those is collections, and the other is remix. And so we'll talk about that in a second. So when you use something that either in a collection or as an adaptation or remix, you do need to attribute the work. So you need to cite it, just like you would if you were writing an academic paper. And that's where that tassel comes in handy. And so the tassel that you use to write to license your work, to say, by the way, this is a BY40, this is my fish, that fish that I did, that's the exact same thing that that person using that thing is going to use to attribute your work. So that's all they need to put in the, if they use it in an exhibit, this is all you need legally to have in your exhibit to basically say that it's okay for me to have this fish picture in whatever capacity I'm using, as long as I'm sticking to what the extra stuff of whatever this license is telling me to do. So for all of you who are in the academic strain, so citations are not attributions in Creative Commons. So Creative Commons attributions, citations are academic, citations are from Creative Commons. Citations are just to map sources for researchers, and Creative Commons purpose is basically to satisfy legal copyright requirements. So those things that those licenses are telling you to do, of like attribute, note if you made changes, all of those things, those are legally required in order for you to use that work without permission. You can always go back and get permission from the person who has copyright over the thing to use it for whatever reason or whatever purpose you want. But if you're going to use it with Creative Commons licensing without having to contract the copyright owner, that's what you need to do. You only have to attribute work that you directly quote or remix when you are using Creative Commons stuff. You don't have to do it if you're just doing a paraphrase of something kind of in that way, whereas in academia you would. And you have to include the tassel info. So this is a citation of that fish that I drew, kind of an APA, to give you an idea, and this is kind of that attribution. So you can see they're slightly different. You can also use an attribution as a citation. You just have to add in the extra stuff that the attribution needs that the citation does not. So for example, it needs to have the licensing. No citation form says include the licensing of the thing that you are using. So you just need to add on in order to make it what it needs to be for the attribution to satisfy legal stuff. Okay. So collections and remixes. So collections are when you take a group of stuff and you basically put them in without changing them in any way. So if you think of a museum exhibit, you don't take the paintings that you have on the walls in the museum exhibit and like change them drastically. They're just sitting there. A remix is when you actually sufficiently change something around enough for it to almost stand up as a separate work. And depending on how you use something, that changes how you license it with Creative Commons. So let's talk about collections. So if I'm making this poster and I have decided to use some works that have licenses. So if these are things that already have CC licenses, so I'm just putting these on my poster unchanged. These retain their licenses because I haven't made any changes. Meanwhile, I have control of all these things that I have created for the poster. So the bowl, the spoon, that any text I add, the order of the things on this on the sheet, all of that stuff. But I still have to consider the fact that other things have Creative Commons licenses. So those licenses come into play when I basically give my own stuff a license. So for licensing and collection, super easy, such a treat. You use this handy dandy little chart, which you'll all have copies of, and you can see, depending on whether, basically it all comes down to what is the license of the original work, and are you going to be using this for this new collection that you've created? Is this a commercial purpose or is this non-commercial? Because that changes what licenses you can use, and you can use any of the licenses basically under here. The only thing is like for non-commercial, you can't use, of course, any of the commercial stuff. That's literally the only thing. So if I have any of these things, so the flour, the salt, the water, all of these things have licenses that I could use either a commercial or a non-commercial collection, but because I have also included a non-commercial object in my larger poster, I can't use a commercial collection license, any of these. So I'm gonna have to use any of these on my poster for my new work. So here is my little poster citation down here. I've chosen to use a BY non-commercial, so attribution non-commercial. I still have to mention that I've used other bits of these things that have their own licenses. So again, not screwing over future users, pointing out that, by the way, there are some things on here that have separate licenses that this license over here doesn't necessarily apply to. So let's talk about remix and adaptation works. This is where it gets grossly messy. So this is where you've basically thrown all those things together, you put them in an oven, and you've come out with something completely different. So this lovely loaf of bread, if I did all that flour, water, and yeast. So here's my fish picture. I've made a different change to that fish picture. So here's my adaptation. So let's talk about licensing this little monster. So this is complicated. So this is where things get messy. So basically, depending on how many things you have used to create a derivative, the path changes. So let's start with a simple one. So if I just used one work, so just my original fish picture, to change this, to make a derivative work, this new work here, let's see what that does. So once again, you use this handy dandy little adapters chart, and you basically find the status of the original work. So what was the original license of the thing that I used to create this? And then I can choose from the licenses that allows. So if it's green, great. If it's yellow, technically I could use it, but it's probably not recommended because there's some dirtiness involved. Gray, absolute hard no. The license won't work. So for example, for my fish picture, it was a BY, which again, lovely and open. So you can see you can use a lot of things. And so I can use any of these licenses here for my new work. When you use two or more things, that's when it gets really gross, guys. I'm not gonna lie, it's really gross. So this is the chart for if you have two or more things. So the first thing, it's called the license compatibility chart. If you have just used two works together, it's slightly easy. You basically cross compare again. So if I were to just use the flour and the water, you just say, what is the first works license? What is the second works license? Aha, I can give it a B. These two works will work together. I can use these. This is not licensing it first. This is just to make sure that you can use it together, that they don't clash. When you have more than the two, this is where it gets complicated. You basically have to create a little flow chart and basically measure them against each other. So from here, you can automatically see, because the water says no derivatives, I can't use that at all. So I'm going to have to cut that out of whatever work I've made. I'm going to have basically bread with no, maybe I'm going to have to substitute in egg. I can't, or oil. I can't use water in this bread that I'm making if I'm doing a remix. If everything works together, if you've done that and you're like, okay, everything will work together licensee wise. Now the license you can give the bread, the new thing you've made, you basically have to go object by object, and using that adapters chart, write down, these are all the ones that I could possibly use for this license. Then you go to the next one, you say, these are all the licenses I could possibly use for the second one. Cross out anything that these two things don't match with. So there's that. Continue on. Go through and do that for every single one, and the ones that you're left with, those are the possibilities you could give your own. So it's a bit of a trek. I've given you a nice little flow chart in your handout, so hopefully you can get to it easier. When it comes to attributing it, again, it's so you basically have to point out that this came from something. So this work, which is the new fish, which is plaid fish, is a derivative of, and then you do that little thing and then eventually give your license of what your license, the new license for your new thing that you came out of. So there's that new one of, that's the remixes license versus my old license for that old fish picture I did. I'm not going to do this because we're running out of time. Just a thing of like, how is this change your perception of the creator versus the user of the license? So all of a sudden BY looks real bad if you're like, no, I want my thing to be protected, versus like if you have to use it later, you're like, oh no, please BY. And I will end it there. These are some resources of what I talked about, the glam stuff. And I will stop sharing so we can do questions because we're running out of time.